Okay, and for today, we have what we think is one of the most important topics on teaching law and society. And in the past few years, these have been transformative years. Transformative years for, as we know, some of the events have been outside of our control, as been the case of the pandemic, and that's actually created, on one hand, novel topics for teaching and learning, but also new circumstances in terms of teaching. Another major, I would say, more systemic and in the longer run, a significant series of changes have had to do with increasing pressures for the recognition of justice in a variety of areas related to discrimination. And one of the key, pretty much the start, sort of the building block of all these efforts has to do with addressing police brutality. And that, of course, has put the eyes on the question of the future of policing and the connection between policing and race. This has been a question not only for the United States, and we know that this is, in the United States, this is a country where these discussions have been going on for decades, and in the context of Black Lives Matter, well, mattered even more. But this has also had resonance with realities of a similar kind that have been unfolding in other countries around the world. That is the case in Australia, and that is also the case in Canada, in Europe, in Latin America, and so forth. And in this particular workshop, we want to hear from three colleagues who are engaged in teaching race, police brutality, and what it means also for thinking through the future of policing. And I can tell you that presents several challenges. I teach police society and democracy at LaTrobe University, and of course, it's a productive challenge. It's a challenge with a lot of opportunities as well, but at the same time, it's difficult in a series of ways. In the end, you are engaging with students who, on one hand, are very curious and very willing to engage with the topic and to make a difference, but at the same time, face, as we know, a time where what we're doing in the classroom is also colliding with information that's disseminating in all kinds of ways through social media, and what is effectively a very polarized political environment. So what follows, we will have first Professor Tyre Nichols joining us from Dominican University. Then we'll have Professor Ningard from Ohio University, and then Professor Vicki Sentas from University of New South Wales, Sydney. Now, each of them will talk for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll have make a few comments, and of course, then we're also going to open the floor for questions and comments. We hope that what we're going to start is a conversation. So feel free to, as the conversation goes, start popping in questions, comments in the chat box, and we'll address them, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentations. So without further ado, once again, thank you so much to our guests for coming, and Clinton, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and hello, everybody. I'm going to share my screen because I made a little PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully it'll go a little bit better than how it did for me this morning when I tried to do this. So, all right. I teach a course called Police and Society for undergraduate criminology and sociology majors at my university. And in 2021, I had the pleasure of being a History Makers Innovative Pedagogy Fellow. The History Makers is the largest digital archive of life histories of African Americans in the United States. And so I was part of a cohort where we revised existing course syllabi to sort of better center the experience of African Americans. Most of my colleagues were teaching courses about African American history, or they were teaching courses that were part of an African American studies program. So I was a bit of an outlier in that my course was a sort of like a course in sociology, criminology, but it wasn't specifically focused on African Americans. So what I endeavored to do was to have students encounter life histories through this digital archive in terms of the classroom teaching experience, through reflection assignments, and as part of a final project or a final reflection that they did. And so this resulted in hands-on use of the digital archive. I developed materials related to searching, to saving clips from the archive, and for how students could cite the archive. So basically, students learned how to navigate the archive, and by the end of the semester, there was the expectation that they could do this in a very sophisticated manner. So given where we were at in 2021 with the pandemic, I met with students about every other week, and the idea was that these would be workshops where we would explore a particular component, and then in the off week they would wrap up a reflection assignment. So I began with police and its relationship to the media. We looked at the origins and development of modern police departments and their practices. We thought about joining, what it means to join and to leave a police force, characteristics of officers in terms of demographics, and the way in which officers become assimilated to the working culture of policing. We explored issues related to diversity and discrimination, the structure and organization of departments, in particular with a focus on labor management tensions as an aspect of police work and the structure of departments. And thought about officer and department misconduct and reform challenges. And so throughout, students had to identify relevant stories from the digital archive. So as an example, Andrea Zopp, in recounting her parents, she talks about how her mother was one of the first women police officers in Rochester, New York. She worked for about a year as a woman police officer, and then basically Andrea Zopp's father was more or less like, oh no, I don't want you working as a police officer. And Andrea's mother had to go on to find other types of like work opportunities, and was successful in landing opportunities related to higher ed administration later in her life. But this was a nice opening because it invited students to reflect on her mother's motivation to become a police officer, her experience of job satisfaction as Andrea understood it, given her age at the time, and possible experiences of gender and race discrimination that she would have experienced. And that in relation to what was the Rochester Police Department's motivation for hiring women, who within the department might have championed hiring women, and what does this give us to think about in terms of assumptions about gender, policing, and the type of work that initial officers have to do, such as nighttime patrol, which is something that Andrea's mother had to do. And in this sense, Andrea Zopp's story about her mom resonated really nicely with Rosa Brooks' Tangled Up in Blue, and Peter Moskos, his Cop in the Hood, both of which are experiences about an initial time period of being a police officer. And of course, with Norm Stamper's book, To Protect and Serve, where he is honest about ways in which he was not sort of like human rights focused police officer in his initial years. I developed specific learning goals and specific units. So I wanted students to really understand an intersectional relationship between police department hierarchy, officer discretion, and race and gender. I wanted to really push students to move away from a sort of like bad apple type of framework to really thinking about a much more nuanced a way of understanding how police officers can and cannot act in the context of their work. Howard Saffold is one of the history makers who has been interviewed. He worked on a special task force within the Chicago Police Department during the time that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And he was in a squad car with two other African-American task force officers when they intervened in a call that they heard over the police communication system. And so this is a quote from his interview where he says that white officers had a black guy in basically an alley behind a store. The guy was had been brutally beaten, and the officers were trying to shut out the streetlights. And people who were hearing this, who witnessed this, they were yelling for the officers to let the man go. And Saffold sort of says that he and his colleagues came in. They basically retrieved this man who's being beaten by white officers, and they took him to the county hospital. And with the story, he says that it's, they're being conscientious guys, but this really speaks to the fact that he was part of a specialized task force. So he was able to step in a way that if he had been a patrol officer, he might not have been able to. He might have had to at that time witness simply this violent police encounter. And the idea here is I wanted them to think about Harold Saffold's rank that enabled him and his colleagues to intervene. And I wanted them to think about the white officers' actions of shooting out the lights, that there's a theatricality to policing. And there's a narrative aspect to policing, and that shooting out the lights could be a way in which they could present a narrative where they could be able to counter the public's narrative. They could be able to say, so like, how could you have seen this? The lights, there were no street lights, essentially. And then to add another complication to this particular story and Harold Saffold's experience, they took this man to Cook County Hospital, and an African-American nurse called Harold Saffold and his colleagues Uncle Toms, a pejorative term essentially for sort of like being a collaborator in terms of racial oppression within the African-American community. So here we have a situation where we see Harold Saffold experiencing a type of alienation by another Black professional, even though he and his colleagues were trying to sort of like, as he would put it, do the right thing. I developed a number of assignments that invited students to use and explore the digital archive. And so one was Stopped While Black. And this invited students to consider the way police officers and departments have related to African Americans with a focus on traffic and pedestrian stops. And so I provided 3 stories from the archive, and then invited students to find 3 other stories. And I ultimately adapted this assignment for my Introduction to Criminology course, where I had students look at traffic stop data for their local community if they live here in Illinois, and do some very basic descriptive statistics to identify percentages, to think about whether or not they see racially disproportionate practice in terms of who's getting stopped by their local police department. And then to combine that with history maker stories, to think about what is the impact of discriminatory traffic or pedestrian stops? How does that erode police-community relations? Another assignment focused on addressing alienation. And here I invite students to consider course material about officer demographics, police unions and associations, and history maker stories about the development of the Afro-American Patrolmen's League here in Chicago, an organization that emerged in the 1970s and sued the Chicago Police Department for discriminatory practices and sued them successfully. And again, students had to find 3 other stories to think about how Black and white officers related to each other on duty, to think about workplace discrimination, and how Black officers related to their local Black community or neighborhood. And here students reflections considered institutional theory, such as stories where history makers were describing finding white allies within the police department, as well as their descriptions about labor management conflicts as an aspect of policing. And then final assignment was a sort of who inspires you assignment. And this was a reflection where students identified 5 to 8 history makers and aspects of their stories, individuals who had careers in policing and or were either internal critics of police departments, or they were external critics. They might have been community organizers, they might have been lawyers, other activists, critics of policing, in order to reflect on their own professional ambitions. I teach at a university where the majority of students are students of color. Dominican University is a Hispanic serving institution and has been designated so for more than 10 years. And so I'm sensitive to the fact that while my department is a critical sociology and criminology department, I don't want to be telling my students what lines of work they can or cannot go into. I would rather that they at least are confronted with, these are some realities if you're going to go into policing. I do have some colleagues who take a firmer abolitionist stance compared to myself. But this is how I have been moving in terms of teaching about police and society. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I will look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Clinton, thank you so much. Thank you for such a rich and interesting presentation, and what a set of interesting assignments. I mean, I have a couple of questions to ask you, but I'll hold them until the end of the 3 presentations. Very exciting, Clinton. Thank you so much. We now go from Clinton to Holly. Holly, welcome to our first webinar once again, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sad to follow Clinton because I did not prepare slides, but I am also happy to follow Clinton because thank you so much. That was incredible. And you raised a lot of themes that I think about when I construct my class. So like Clinton, I teach a police and society course in a sociology and criminology department. So many of our majors are criminology majors. Ohio University is a predominantly white institution. We get a lot of students from all over the state of Ohio, but also a lot of out-of-state students as well. And one of the themes that I think that my students often come to class with is this question of how did we get here, right? There are a ton of news stories that they've come in and they've been hearing about, and they're thinking about how did we get to this particular point? And so I wanted to design my course around an answer to that. And I know that's kind of I think a lot of us are used to in our classes teaching a how did we get here approach. So I really wanted to take that and try to have some answers, or at least the start of an answer. And one of the first ways that I do that is by trying to break out of this binary that law seems to sometimes give us. So I'm very attached to Patricia Williams' The Alchemy of Race and Rights, and this segment that she talks about law and legal thinking kind of getting us into these categories of right and wrong and guilty and not guilty, and the law of and law being this finite thing that's above us, and policing and law enforcement in general are of course part of that, part of the courts, part of the criminal legal system as a whole. And so we start with that. We start with thinking about, well, what other ways can we think about law? What other ways can we think about this? And I try to make it break out of those binaries and talk about how law is far more dynamic than that. And so too then is its enforcement. And so we start with an overview of history, and we move throughout history and move through the decades and talk about the evolution. And in this, I try to get my students to think not about policing as just a career, although of course those are topics that we talk about, and we talk about police culture, and we compare, you know, the bad apples theory with systemic theories of misconduct, and we get into that. But I try to think about it more, if we put our sociology hats on, as a pattern of behavior, right? So when we teach about police and society, we're of course teaching about law enforcement, but I'm like, what about law enforcement as a patterned behavior? Something that we can think about as not just step by step, how do you do this job, but also as something that interacts with other longstanding patterns of behavior like politics and the courts and social media and mass media. And by trying to get students to think about law enforcement as that pattern of behavior and as something that's broader than a career and a little bit more dynamic, I think that it helps them understand and engage with the fact that a lot of these ideas, you know, when we talk about abolition or defund the police, or why there are so many modern uprisings for justice, that these are not new, right? These are ideas that are deeply rooted in the study of law and in the study of our justice system. They're deeply, you know, they go back to, you know, deep in our roots. And so I try to say that while they might be new to us in terms of how we frame these discussions, and there might be cases that are new, and it might be new to them, these are old ideas that really speak to this question of what do we want police to do? What do we want law enforcement to do, right? Policing is one iteration of law enforcement. And that's a big question that we have to confront. So as we move through history and our contemporary topics, I'm kind of constantly, I'm that annoying voice in the back of their head saying, what's the goal? Like, what do we want this to accomplish? What's the purpose? And is it trying to get there? And I think that that helps getting students into thinking about, you know, how some of these issues are a lot older than we tend to think, and have been more longstanding than we tend to think. And so that brings me to, in a very broad, over the broadest sense that I could think to talk about it, to the policing philosophy assignment that I've been developing. And it's an ongoing development. I tweak it every semester. And I wish I could say that I came up with it from scratch. I was prepping for this course, and I was reading as many syllabi and ideas that I could, and doing it 5 years ago when I started at Ohio University. And I came across an assignment, and I cannot find this assignment. So I apologize to the person who the seed of this assignment came from, but it was in a group or a thread where people were sharing assignments on Twitter, which is where I like to read about teaching materials. And and it was just getting students to question, you know, the policing philosophy that was community policing. That's what it was originally. And I thought that that was such an innovative assignment for getting students to think about formulating their own arguments when it comes to how they view police. And I thought it tied so well into the question of how did we get here, because when you think about what's at the heart of the protests and those who are seeking justice and abolition and defunding movements, it's that police are not doing the things that we think that they ought to do, right? That policing as an institution is not serving roles that it purports to serve. So I wanted to use that as an exercise in getting my students to think about how this goes. And so we, for example, we use the book as part of our history section. We use Radley Balko's The Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police force. And one of the arguments that Balko iterates throughout that is that if the war on drugs was purported to be a war that was, you know, meant to get drugs off the street and keep communities safer, then it has failed miserably, as many of us in here know, and as has been something that we teach about. And so I try to get students to look at that argument and see, okay, what's the goal? What are we doing to get to the goal, and is that working, right? And that's sort of how I break it down, because a lot of students are in my institution are frankly a little hesitant to engage with critical material as it relates to law enforcement, and the idea of abolition is a little uncomfortable. And so what I try to do by going through this history and asking about goals and strategies to get there is to say that this is something that's been a part of policing since its inception in our in our country. It's a dynamic institution. It's not one of those binaries, those static things that we think about. It's something that is kind of constantly changing, and this is how we can go about doing that. And so the policing philosophy tasks students with coming up with a goal that they think that police ought to serve in society, what they think that police should do, what law enforcement ought to do. And this can be anything. I'm open. They do have to find scholarly literature to support the importance of the goal. They can't just say that, they can't just give me something that they wish police would do without some type of support that this is a goal. So I work with students to try to read through, law review articles and peer-reviewed documents. And then sometimes we look at reports out of the DOJ. And they find a goal, and sometimes I have those, and sometimes my students will pick goals of defunding the police and abolition, and those are also options in there as well. So I ask them to give me a goal, and then I ask them to apply that to 2 contemporary criminal justice issues. So they pick 2 points. It can be whatever they're interested in investigating. They introduce those issues, and then they give me 1 evidence-based strategy that both addresses the issue that they've introduced while also responding and furthering that goal. Okay. So I had a really, and then they go through those and they give me the strategies, and then they kind of write up a summary. And in recent times of iterations of doing this, I've opened this up. It used to be just a straight term paper, and more I'm encouraging my students to do multimedia projects. So things like podcasts. My students are really big into iMovie. I'm not a Mac user, so I don't know how they do it. It's very mystical to me, but it's beautiful, the things that they come up with and the creativity that they instill in these projects. They're incorporating video clips and sounds, and they're doing all sorts of cool animations. And I'm like thinking my PowerPoints are so archaic at this point, looking at what they're putting together. So for example, I had one student who wanted to, he selected the goal of community policing, and part of how he wanted to further that goal was he was talking about the war on drugs, and he was talking about new drug policies and different types of decriminalization laws that were happening. And then he also chose the development of certain drug studies that are using things like psilocybin and testing psilocybin on things like PTSD, right? And so he was taking these 2 concepts, and he was basically making the argument that through tracing the war on drugs, that police did not need to be involved in this at all. And so sometimes, like, that's the interesting part of the policing philosophy, is sometimes your strategy is removing police involvement from something, right? It's saying police, it's saying that police maybe do this now, i.e. drug law enforcement, but I don't think that they should, because the evidence there supports the absence of that work, as opposed to a strategy to do that work. So I leave it very open, and I think that there's Tyler Wall, Dr. Tyler Wall. He's out at the University of Tennessee. When I got a job at Ohio University as a graduate student, I was talking with him about this class, and if he had any advice. And one of the pieces that he spoke about that really stuck with me is just meeting students where they're at. And I think that when I have this major question about how did we get here, I want to help my students understand that history, to give that context, right? But I also want to meet them where they're at in formulating these arguments. So I think this is a good project that allows them to do this research and to take these ideas that they might have about policing and see, is there merit to this? Is there something there? Is this evidence-based? Could this work? And I think that process of learning how to look at policy and evaluate policy helps to demystify some of these conversations, looking at the history of arguments about abolition, and looking at what abolitionists are writing, helps to tell students that it's not this intense concept that a lot of I think you get when you watch mass media, frankly, right? It's not the same as that. It's a concept that can be worked into a lot of different policies in a lot of different ways. So I've been doing a lot of work with that. I've really been encouraging the podcast options. that was my timer that I set for myself, so I do apologize about that. I will wrap up. I've been pushing the multimedia work with my students a lot, and I think that that has allowed them to get even more creative in exploring options. And if there's one thing that we know that abolition does, it's to go back to that law as binary, right? And break us out of that. I want my assignments to break us out of academic binaries and just thinking about writing and presenting. And so it's been a very fun assignment to develop over the course of my time here. And I think my students have come up with some great ideas that allow them to really engage with these works beyond maybe their preconceptions that they come into the class with.
Thank you very much, Holly. And I can tell you, listening to you, one of the things that was fantastic. One of the things that I keep coming back to and telling myself every time that I attend a workshop of the consortium center on teaching and learning practices, I come out with utter admiration from my colleagues on the different kind of very creative, very engaging assignments that they think of, particularly to negotiate those tensions that we face when teaching law and society classes more broadly. On one hand, as you say, the need to address, identify, explain, structure, historical background at the same time, would de-emphasize explaining and encouraging them to discover and to engage with the class more productively from their own points of view, to awaken that sense of curiosity. And I can see how that's a running thread between Clinton's approach and your approach. And that, of course, takes into Vicki as well. And Vicki, I did this because in the screen, you're right next to me. So it just, just giving the floor now to you as Professor Sentas from University of New South Wales, Sydney. Thanks, Vicki.
Thank you, Raul. Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much, Clinton and Holly. Fantastic to hear about your thinking and your practice. So greetings, everyone, from Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. I'm joining you from the lands of the Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation. Acknowledge I'm on Aboriginal lands whose sovereignty was never ceded, and sending solidarity to all the struggles of over-police people everywhere in the world. So I want to tell you about a subject I run called the Police Powers Clinic, and it's a little different to the kind of mainstream sort of undergraduate subjects that that have been discussed today, and it's different to some of the other subjects that I also run. It's a clinical legal education or experiential learning subject, but I think a lot of the themes that have been discussed sort of runs through that. And there are some elements of this subject that I've learnt from and taken into my more mainstream teaching as well. So the Police Powers Clinic is a partnership with a community legal centre called Redfern Legal Centre, and it's been running for almost 10 years. So Redfern Legal Centre is a community-run legal centre in a Sydney suburb called Redfern, and it's a really important place for the local Gadigal people. The legal centre originally grew 50 years ago from First Nations struggles for land rights, for self-determination, and it grew originally around self-defence against police brutality. So there was a really strong Aboriginal Black Panthers movement in Redfern in the 1970s that had a strong kind of international solidarity with the American Black Panthers movement. And as a result of that and their land rights kind of activism were the subject to really intensive police disruption and police brutality. So Redfern Legal Centre, that was its origins, was set up by Aboriginal activists at the same time as other Aboriginal controlled community organisations that remain today, like the Aboriginal Legal Service and the Aboriginal Medical Service. So they're both critically important movements and organisations still today in the struggles for justice and self-determination. And also staff and students from my university, UNSW, were involved in helping to set up Redfern Legal Centre in the 1970s. So we see our clinic's history as part of our ongoing, not just context, but our commitment to communities and as a part of setting up as a part of like the ongoing relationships that our students learn from and with. And that can be as concrete as Indigenous activists coming and talking to our students. One year when a really, prominent Indigenous elder, involved in the struggle against policing, died, we moved the clinic to their, memorial where students got to learn, and hear all about, their work. So that's just one example. So the clinic is part of the Sentas' statewide specialist police complaint service. So more broadly, the Legal Centre also advises local people in other areas of law around, has a specialisation in domestic violence, employment and discrimination. So it's a free legal service, especially targeted to supporting people who can't otherwise afford legal services. And importantly, Redfern is part of a broader network of hundreds of community legal centres across Australia who all share similar features. So critically, this isn't just about servicing individual clients, but looking at broader patterns and relations of power and being advocates for systemic justice issues. So that's the context in which our students are placed. So all of our clients are poor. Many are Aboriginal people who in this country are the most criminalised over police and mass incarcerated. And so when we talk about race and policing in Australia, it goes hand in hand with the continuing role of the police institution in colonial dispossession and the police role in disrupting people's everyday lives, and in that way disrupting people's everyday self-determination. So that's the key critical kind of context that shapes the structure and the logic of the course. So I take 6 final year or penultimate undergraduate law students who work a day a week across each of our 3 terms at the centre. The students have a go at being real life young lawyers with real life clients and real police problems. So the ethos of the clinic is about mentoring students in this sort of small, kind of safe yet highly challenging environment to embed them in community legal centre life, to learn about systemic change and social change lawyering, which by its nature around a police complaint service means activist and community development skills. So where I was interested to hear you talk, Holly, about subverting the kind of usual relationship of kind of, that we have to law. And also the point that you made about working with students where you find them is very much, a lot of our students kind of, are already on board, but many of them are not. They sort of see this as a way to kind of get practical kind of legal experience, but, not necessarily on board with kind of police abolition or even reforming the police. But at the end of it, they certainly are, because they're embedded in a community legal centre where their responsibility is to the clients first and foremost. So there's a real question of in whose interests are we doing this lawyering for? So students work under supervision with me, as well as interaction with solicitors on client matters around police abuse of power. So this is routinely, our bread and butter are unlawful racialised stop and search, strip searches, violent arrests, move on directions, assaults, unnecessary charges for a range of presence in public, kind of so-called offences, malicious prosecutions. So that the day-to-day work that students do is really diverse, from drafting letters to clients, analysing police documents, an emphasis on practical legal writing. The concept of the complaint to the police is a really fascinating, complex, piece of legal advocacy that they learn how to write. So the emphasis is on analysis, problem solving, interviewing clients, going with solicitors to court, going down to the station to negotiate with police, to view police footage, and exposure to every messy aspect of community legal centre life. So there's 2 kind of main dimensions of the work students do, which, has had me thinking a lot about bringing elements of this into, regular kind of courses on policing. So, you know, we support clients with complaints against the police, but we also do research and policy work and community legal education work. And that consists of working with the needs of local community around policing and campaign work for Redfern Legal Centre. And in the past few years, this has focused on campaigns against racialised over-policing, including the strip searches of largely Aboriginal communities and predictive, so-called predictive preemptive policing. You know, those kind of algorithmic risk assessments that, you know, you're very familiar with in the United States. And, you know, in the Australian context, well, in the New South Wales context, the vast majority of those people on those repressive predictive lists are First Nations people. So as part of our kind of clinical day, we have, you know, a 2-hour kind of seminar where we have set readings, both of like an academic, you know, theoretical policy-based nature. And that, you know, will cover things like theoretical readings around how should we think about the relationship between law and policing. You know, because luckily the kind of work that we do, the complaint work, you know, very much sees students slip in very naturally to this idea of law and policing being antagonistic to each other. That, you know, that law is like this sort of defender of the people and a limit point for police. But we very quickly look at how law is this kind of expansive kind of basis for police authority. So it's an enabler, you know, as well as a limit point, and it makes police power possible. So they're thrown into those kind of contradictions and limit points, you know, immediately. You know, we get them to read statements of claim in anti-discrimination cases against the police for systemic racial profiling and a range of other kind of policy submissions. So it's a space to connect the readings to the problems and practice that they're working on. And in turn to connect this to the problem of police power. So our complaint work is, I guess, one of the key objects of our pedagogy about how we want students to understand and reflect on the problem of racialized police power. So our starting point is that the system of police complaints is broken and it's structurally geared in state interests and the police interests. So we really throw them into the deep end around, you know, get them to understand for themselves, you know, that the foundational problem is that most complaints are investigated by police themselves, and that only a very small handful are investigated by the independent police watchdog. So they learn about this through reading dense statutes and policy. You know, they read the history of how the system evolved, paradoxically from anti-corruption royal commissions, you know, that determined that the best way, you know, to solve police corruption was to make police managers responsible for investigating complaints. And importantly, they learn this from reading multiple client files, past, present client files that were declined for investigation, or they were investigated and found to be no police wrongdoing. So we do a lot of reflecting. There's no formal assessment because the assessment is participation in the clinic itself. So there's a lot of structured reflection on why is this the case. You know, when you think about it, you know, as Clinton and Holly talked about in the historical and the social context of power. So, you know, one of the things that's really beautiful about the philosophy of clinical legal education, which is itself conducive to anti-racism pedagogies, is that the methodology promotes a unity between theory and practice. So some of, you know, we start with our central problem. Why is police accountability broken? Is it possible or desirable to fix it? If so, how? If not, why? What are the alternatives? And, you know, one example where we think this through is through our campaign work and past campaign work, and get students to, you know, engage with that and analyse it. So one of the campaigns the Legal Centre and our students were involved in 5 years ago was around abolishing predictive policing in New South Wales. You know, our program is called the Suspect Target Management Plan. And it was actually through the clinic and our clinic clients that we discovered its existence, because it was a secret program. So, you know, after a few years of research that I was involved in, the Legal Centre and other community legal centres started a campaign to try and get rid of it. And we were successful in convincing the independent police watchdog to start a coercive investigation against New South Wales Police on the basis that this predictive policing was serious agency maladministration, that it's oppressive, discriminatory conduct. And one of our key recommendations was, how about we get rid of this altogether and encourage government to put resources into Aboriginal controlled community organisations and others to focus on culturally appropriate, therapeutic, trauma-informed programs to support people's lives. So one of the things we do is, and we've done this with a number of other community-based campaigns, is we get students to look at the recommendations of the investigative body's interim report, 25 recommendations. And in a nutshell, the recommendations, are, the classic trope of reform to make things better. So it doesn't recommend getting rid of the program, but ways to perfect it. So improving the risk algorithm, better police training and policy, better outreach with communities, focusing on community policing, encouraging police to swap coercive techniques for engagement. So it's a very classic case of excellent data, but very disappointing reformist recommendations that are aimed at deepening consent and legitimacy. So we get the students to really sit down and dissect the recommendations and trace what are the likely predictable effects of each of these recommendations, to sort of draw on the literature and kind of where can this take us? To get them to think about the nature of police power and the effects on the people who are policed. And the students then consider to come up with alternate recommendations that they would design, and to consider how might these deepen or lessen police power. What might deepen or lessen community well-being, and to think about in whose interests are each of the recommendations. And we also get students to think about barriers and opportunities for their recommendations. In particular, we get them to think about what are the political, cultural, institutional, organizational issues that mean it might be highly unlikely or likely for a reform body to recommend, abolition of this program. But even if it doesn't, what other forms of social action are possible? So I've done this a few times with, you can do it with any set of policy recommendations or other recommendations that come out of any institutional reform process around policing, to get students to engage in a practice of thinking of systems otherwise, and the practical reality and possibility of rolling back police power through shrinking the footprint, through a reform process, but also through building forms of other social power outside of state institutions. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vicki. Thank you again, Holly and Clinton. This has been fascinating. And of course, we've heard three different approaches to the questions that bring us together today. What I want to do now is to engage in conversation. I have a few questions for all of you. They've really cut across the three presentations, I think speak more broadly to some of the queries and tensions and opportunities that we face in teaching and learning these topics. But before I do, I want to encourage everyone to ask your questions, to share your comments. Please, on the chat box, any question that you might have for Clinton, Holly, and Vicki, and we will of course include it in the conversation. In the meantime, I'll share with you a few of the ideas and comments that you probably saw me typing, here and there. I'll share them with you, hopefully also as well after the presentation. As I'm listening to you, it is clear that we're in this area. We definitely have moved away from teaching to, from sharing only content, and from seeing our mission as one of identifying or demystifying what is quote unquote true about this theme. And that I'm saying that because perhaps in the past the main emphasis was on trying to, for example, share with our students, or try to teach our students concepts or key methods or key ideas about race and policing, whereas now we're engaging really and learning with them. Now, this is what's coming from all the three of your presentations. The emphasis is more on encouraging students to explore and discover and figure out the complexities of these issues by themselves in a structured and supported, constructive way. And I'm talking also about the nuances, because all three of your approaches point in that direction as well. Whether it is from the point of view of learning about biographical profiles and historical context, to learning about patterns, as Holly emphasized, and the importance of socio-political context, to Vicki's experiential learning, work-based, work-integrated learning approach that is really less emphasis on work. It's more service learning, to be perfectly honest. This is actually very interesting. A few questions that I have for you. When you in terms of design, when you designed your classes, to what degree, for example, you took into account the particular conditions of the community where you live, the students you serve? This is a point, for example, that Clinton pinpointed. And also, this is something that we've all experienced, the tensions that we have internally, for example, of a bureaucratic kind. Number of students, support, for example, from our respective faculty contexts, and other aspects of teaching in an area that changes every year. Now, this is something that every year, every month, really, but every time we teach the class, there is something new to engage with. There is something new to offer. And I don't know who of the three of you would like to comment first. Clinton.
Yeah, I'll I think offer an initial response. I've given thought to things like trying to, or encouraging students to do a police ride-along, or to attend their local city council meeting. And a real challenge that I face is the fact that I have students who, on top of taking classes full-time, they're often working almost full-time, and may have really intense family obligations. So I don't have a situation where a majority of my students are having the type of undergraduate experience I had, where I went to a school, it was a residential undergraduate institution. So I was living on campus, I was away from home, there was nothing essentially to do other than be a student full-time, and then of course, sort of having fun. So and I have a situation where students are largely showing up to class and then leaving. And that's it. And the ability for them to be able to schedule other things is a real challenge.
Thank you, Clinton. Yes, Holly.
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. Oh yeah, okay, cool. Oh, I thought I was on mute. I definitely do. My so I Ohio University is a residential campus as well, but I also teach this course online. And a lot of our online students also deal with these types of obligations. I definitely take that into account. And I think part of the reason why I emphasize so much an assignment in which they are learning to construct an argument that they can support. And this definitely bridges into like one of the questions that we have in the chat, but it's one of the things that I try to emphasize is, that this is not just a paper that you're writing or a podcast that you're doing or a presentation that you're making that is busy work. It's something that's informing what's happening outside of this classroom. And so emphasizing so many of the topics we teach have applicability, of course, outside, and there's real lives and experiences behind all the statistics that I think sometimes when you're going through stats and patterns, it feels very flat and like there's not these lived experiences. So I'm trying to tie it into why we do what we do and the importance of having these arguments in an informed way. That tends to help. I definitely take into account how many students I have. Sometimes my students, typically this is a class of 35 students, so it's very manageable when you think about keeping a project up. And we do a lot of we break it down by checkpoints that they're turning in throughout the course of the semester, and so that's helpful. But sometimes it's 75 students, and so sometimes we're getting to the meat of the arguments really quickly. But I think it's part of the reason of why I talk about allowing them to form these arguments and bring these together is that we're just looking at this is getting into epistemology. We're looking at one form, one way of studying how we got here, and of course our lived experiences are another way that we know about the world. What we see, what we experience directly, but also what we read in the news. And what I try to tell them is this is just another way to argue, another way to not argue like get in fights, but argue, form an argument and contextualize what it is that they're doing, and to learn how to take this material outside of the class with them. So that's how I tend to think about conveying the importance of the assignment.
Thank you so much, Holly and Vicki.
I might pass on this one just so we've got time to answer more questions, because Holly and Clinton totally answered that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we do have a question that I think dovetails very well with your presentation, Vicki. And this is from our colleague, Asadi. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and great ideas. My question is, do you have any tips for colleagues that are trying to include some of these wonderful ideas in more traditionally conservative compulsory law classes that offer less flexibility? And Vicki, I understand that you either teach at a law school or you teach in connection with a law school. Several of our programs are either linked to law schools or more traditional legal education. That, of course, gives room for fascinating discussions with our colleagues, but also some challenges with respect to teaching and learning. So, Vicki.
Look, it's a great question, as it is, when we're in really sort of traditional conservative compulsory law classes, starting with the question of, policing and race, an obvious kind of compulsory subject, like the way that I've incorporated that is, say, in criminal law, when we're talking about kind of police powers or kind of doctrinal questions around the elements of offences. I've taken, with the consent of a client from the clinic, and we use it all across our compulsory class, is when we're teaching arrest, for example. So we'll use a clip from an actual person's experience with their consent, and they're do not anonymize, but they've taken footage of a purported arrest with a police officer. And we get students to kind of go through the arrest power on the law and to sort of identify the lawful authority for police kind of arrest and all the elements of it. And we get them to listen and watch this dialogue where effectively the police officer is purporting to give their kind of legal reasons for the arrest. And then we get the students to kind of listen to this 5-minute clip and then to sort of break it down and analyze and go, well, do they have a lawful basis for their authority? And you can sort of see the intimidation, the violence of the encounter, but also the violence of the law that they're purporting to use. So that's a really obvious answer in terms of how you can use that in criminal law, but you can do something similar in constitutional law, for example. There are all of these really interesting high court cases which involve police powers and the question of race. You can use case studies. You can look at it in terms of land law. So I think that the basic principle of starting with people's experiences of state power can be used as case studies in any law subject, but particularly around policing and race. But also the techniques that Clinton is talking about in terms of biography, systems of power are peopled, and students really respond really well to sort of stories about people in power or people challenging power. So yeah, just one quick example. I'm sure there are others that people have in mind, and those in the audience that they themselves use.
The emotional engagement with the students, and as you say, Vicki, and how the connection with personal stories can be very powerful to these ends. And we do have, in that sense, first, I have a couple of questions emerging, and you're right, Vicki, you know, we're having more and more questions as the debate is going, so we want to get to all of them. Julie, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this wonderful panel. I'm joining from the Department of Sociology at Brock University in Canada, St. Catharines. And so I'd like to follow up on the point about meeting students where they're at. And so as someone who is teaching criminal justice courses in a sociology department, I think one thing that I've been thinking through is the role of, or the issue of, trigger warnings versus pedagogies of discomfort. And so the issues that I talk about in my classes are very concerning. We're talking about police brutality, we're talking about over-policing, police-related deaths. And so given the demography of my classes, there may be some students for whom this is a new issue, and there are students that that may be closer to the issue, that these are not just issues but also realities that are impacting their communities. And so one thing that I've tried to find a balance around is how to respect or accommodate students whose communities are more directly impacted. And so really kind of specifying certain moments in the course where, depending on how unfiltered or unsanitized the material is, signaling that students may be able to opt out of this if this is something that has directly affected their families or communities, because it is quite harsh. And I'm thinking about, for example, Sherry Williams' work that looks at the impact of images, social media about police brutality on, for example, Black youth. But on the other hand, I have been trying to signal to students who haven't been as affected by these issues personally. I have been trying to find a way to ask them to be confronted, so that kind of signaling, like, if you haven't had to think about these issues before, then preparing them for discomfort, preparing them for particular emotional responses, but asking them to confront those head on. And so I was curious from the panel if this is something that has come up in your classes, in your teaching, and how that's been handled. So these kind of different relationships to these issues that students may have. Thanks.
Julie, thank you so much for your question and your comment and your question. This is fascinating and very important. I think we'll go with Holly first, and then Clinton, if you like. And I'm doing this because yes, Holly.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important question, and something that I'm constantly thinking about. There's Albert has some great questions in the chat that I'm also thinking about, and I mentioned, that asked me today and how I approach it, and then ask me next semester, and then ask me the one after that. But I very heavily.
Holly, just very briefly, just a second. I'm sorry for interrupting. It's just I think that this is a really good moment to read very quickly Albert's question, because it's pertinent.
Yes.
And Albert asks, sorry for brevity. Clinton said he doesn't push abolitionist politics on students. Holly says she meets students where they are at. Vicki places her students in an environment where they are compelled to be critical of the police. This makes me wonder if we as educators are obligated to push students beyond their limits of understanding and away from beliefs that legitimate police power. And this is directly connected to Julie's point. So apologies for that, Holly. I think it's a good opportunity to engage in the conversation of both questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that. So I think that the way that I approach it is that I do feel obligated to push them to at least engage with ideas that they might reject, right? And I certainly am not naive. I know that there are students who are going to give, there are students who are going to give this a look and maybe give the material a look, maybe roll their eyes. But what I try to challenge them to do is to understand it, right? And to try to form meaningful, good faith engagement with it. And so this is something that we start the class with talking about. We start the class going through all of the different material that we're going to go through, the same way that a lot of us do as we go through our syllabi. But I try to have a more meaningful discussion on that first day, that these are ideas that are out there, and they're out there in terms of either the images, as Julia is pointing to, that you're seeing in protests, that you're hearing in interviews, that you're seeing on Twitter, that you're seeing on Instagram, wherever you're coming at this, you're being exposed to these ideas and you're being exposed to these terms. But how often are you being exposed to the history behind them, and the scholarly history and the evolution of these terms, but also the activist history of these terms? It's not always about academia, certainly often is not, right? In terms of getting experiences that have faced a lot of oppression and brutality. And Vicki, or Julie, I'm so sorry, I think your point was so important about images of violence. I don't show those in my course. I don't think that I think that it's a lot of, I know that there's some questions that go around on social media whenever Tyre Nichols video comes out. It was almost, the spectacle of it was pretty disheartening and gross, that there was this countdown that was attached to it. I think there are enough narratives. We don't need to continue to see it. I know that there's not all populations need to reckon, right? It's white Americans that need to reckon. It's whiteness that needs to reckon with it. So I don't show those images, but we do talk about, of course, like we talk about police brutality. And one of the moments that we talked about is with Rodney King, and the moment that videotape had, and the cultural moment that it was in. And so when we're situating history, we point to that. And then we kind of build from there, though, and we talk about how that history informs things. So I do talk about discomforting topics. I do give content warnings when we are going to discuss violent behavior. I think that it's important to allow students time with that. But I also think it's important to go back to these ideas and say, we can engage with concepts of abolition and where they come from, and reform, even if shades of reform, if you want. You can engage with those ideas and you can hear where this is coming from. And, I'm almost done wrapping up because I don't want to speak over. This is an important question. I want to hear everybody. But Albert asked another follow-up question about like where I start, where we start with the history. I wish I did more of an international start. I do talk about English common law and Roman law and things that we get from that in a very brief sense. I really start with the evolution of different police forces and law enforcement forces in the US, with slave patrols, watchmen, and then vigilante justice that happens out west. That's where it really sort of starts. And I think that the way that we talk about that is just looking at how those different forms of policing then morphed into official state-funded, law enforcement agencies. And so thinking about what function did police serve then? What was their role? If this was about protecting merchant property, if this was about upholding systems of slavery, that's a root that's in there that has, in some spaces, it's the same building, right? It's not, the buildings aren't changing when you move into systems of state-funded policing. So part of the reason I stress history so much too is if you're thinking about, so many times you're hearing me, I try to anticipate the mainstream arguments, right? That's like what I ultimately get at. So if you hear, well, slavery was in the past, or these systems of Jim Crow was in the past and we've passed a law and we've moved on from that. Part of what I want my students to engage with is that it's not so easy as just passing a law and moving on, and that the social context remains and the shades remain. And I think that I try to, at the very least, get my students to understand that, because everybody kind of takes their own path to abolition. Everybody takes their own path to reforms that they believe. But I think that you don't have to support it, but you have to understand it, and you have to understand it in a good faith actual way, not in this, what you're coming to the class thinking because you saw this on the news or something, you know? So I try to, and I think trying to have those discussions, it's something that I repeat a lot, that we're there to do that in a good faith way.
No, thank you very much, Holly. And no, one point as I was listening to you, and this comes back to Clinton's presentation, is that perhaps in the past there was an assumption that, well, you know, our students might not be as interested in history as we would like. My experience in the past 2 years has actually been quite the opposite. They are hungry for knowing more about the past. They're hungry for knowing more about how we got here and what happened. And I think that offers a very powerful opportunity to engage with these questions. Clinton.
Like Holly, I very much struggle with this question that you've raised, Albert. And I think maybe the best way I can describe it is something along the lines of for students who would have an interest in going into policing, I'm very much making sure that I'm saying, you know, think about this, think about this, think about this. So it's things like, do you want to work with people who engage in forms of misconduct? Not necessarily big forms of misconduct, but minor things. You know, it means something that you're working in a corrosive environment. It means something that you're working in an environment where, you know, you're not necessarily going to be supported in terms of your mental well-being, where you are going to be nothing more than a type of like cog in a larger machine, potentially. And I say that in part because I've had students who, not too many, but a few who've approached me about internship opportunities with local police departments here in the Chicago metropolitan area. And that is the rubber hitting the road. That is in a context of an American society that has not, or has walked away from any commitment to making higher education affordable. And so as a result, for my students, they're thinking about, oh, this is a work opportunity that can be lucrative, that I know is going to come with a certain level of financial security that possibly they've not experienced or their families have not experienced. And of course, there's a context of majority of my students being people of color, and a legacy of women, people of color, essentially being told, oh, well, you know what? Yes, maybe you study this, but you can't do this as an actual thing. And I don't want to be the person doing that. I think I very much want to be a person where afterwards someone can come up to me and can be like, didn't I tell you? Didn't I warn you about this? You chose to go down this road. So I want to position myself that way, but I'm very envious of a colleague of mine who is a staunch abolitionist, and I love what she brings to our program. I am probably a waffling abolitionist. It's like there are things I'm like, yes, you know, how to get there, I'm not quite certain, you know. And so that's where I'm at. So I appreciate the question, and I'll mute myself because otherwise I'll just ramble on.
No, thank you so much, Clinton. And you know, bringing it back to the question of what serves our students and the dilemmas they face. You're right. And for a lot of the students we face, there are students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, students of color, and for whom these questions are actually questions of basic questions of their own lives and life pathways. Vicki, would you like to say something in connection to Holly and Clinton?
Oh yeah, just really briefly, like I don't want to take up too much space with the discussion. I want to hear from others. But yeah, look, I think that you know, all of the strategies and subject positions and difficulties that Holly and Clinton have sort of described in their teaching, you know, I've also faced like a room full of students where you're teaching policing critically, but 3/4 of the students want to be police officers. And you know, I think we have to, I love the question from Albert around a responsibility to push students beyond their limits. All good critical education should be doing that, regardless of the topic, especially and particularly around policing and race, and taking on board the nuance and the creativity and the different ways of doing that, and that we've all got you know, different subject positions, but also different entry points and tools for pushing students away. And I agree with Albert that you know, there's a variety of techniques and ways to kind of teach students skills around to move to a critical literacy around how power is reproduced and how it's upheld, because it happens, it's not clear cut, it's super complex. And I think if we can teach students around the reproduction of racial power in all of its forms and how to respond to it, that's the key to me.
And we come back to the issue of getting at that complexity, which is very challenging. Any other questions or comments?
I think one more quick point, if I can make it. It's I think a lot of times too about building off of what Vicki and Clinton were saying. Part of what I try to stress in terms of if you're looking at the systemic problems within law enforcement is we also look at the fact that, you know, policing is not as Clinton really summarized, it's not always a healthy environment for police officers either. So, you know, I try to, when I'm talking to my students about, yes, there are, you know, when we have community issues and when we have issues about power, I'm also like, this is not a supportive environment for people who choose to go into law enforcement. So when you have students who are looking to help their communities, and this is the way that they are taught, you help community, right? I try to push back on that as well, that it can, you know, this is not working in that sense either. You still, we look at you know, we look at substance use and abuse, we look at family violence within law enforcement, we look at mental health issues, we look at a lack of access to mental health care, and all of that is a part of, you know, these systems. And so I think to build from, you know, what my two awesome panelists have been saying is, you know, it's not just this, again, I'm always with Patricia Williams in my binaries. It's not just police versus communities, right? When you teach police and society, you have community members who are going to be police and police who are also members of their community. And so how do you work towards creating a world where we're working towards justice, but that we're also working towards a world where, you know, these problems are being felt all over. I think it's important to note that, you know, I play that side as well, where I say it's also harmful, you know, on the side of the law enforcement. It was the worst, like, it was not a very eloquent way to end that, but that was my big point.
And Vicki or Clinton, would you like to say last couple of words before we wrap up?
I just really appreciate this this discussion that we've had in the presentations. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Clinton. Well, we're pretty much at the end of our presentation and discussion. And on behalf of the consortium, we are very grateful to our presenters and to everyone who came today. I think this was a wonderful conversations, as he is pointing out. We really look forward to the next webinar as well. We encourage you to take a look at our at CULJP, at the consortium's website. I'm sharing it on the chat as well. You know, you can consider signing up to the consortium. And in any case, we're going to keep these webinars open for everyone. And once again, Holly, Clinton, Vicki, you know, you're friends of the consortium, really, and thank you so much for your respective presentations. And this is a conversation. Feel free to send emails. You know, we're going to post it on YouTube as well when we have the opportunity, and to share this resource with your colleagues as well. As we said, the more the merrier. But once again, this is morning here in Australia. It's almost 9:30 in the morning, and I think those of us who live on this side of the world were left invigorated for the rest of the day from such a good, honest, and productive discussion. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you so much. It was great meeting everybody.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you very much,
Yes, thank
Clinton.
you.
Thanks, Vicki.
Thanks, everyone. Let's all stay in touch. And really,
Yes.
I'm happy to get emails from anyone to continue dialogue and discussion.
That would be
Yes.
fantastic. We do have a blog, and if I have a few of the ideas that you discuss, and we could actually think of, translating some of those ideas into a blog post for the community.
Appreciate it.